Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're diving deep into a massive hidden system that's quietly running the global economy behind the scenes. You know, most of us think about the economy as just the stock market, interest rates, or maybe what the major banks are doing. But there is a huge, overarching architecture operating way above all of that. It controls everything from global energy prices to major government policies. Honestly, this system affects the price of almost everything you toss into your grocery cart because it directly dictates the purchasing power of your money itself. We're talking about something absolutely profound that has shaped our entire world for over 50 years. Yep, we're talking about the petrodollar. If you really want to study global finance like a genius and understand how the world actually works, you've got to look past the surface-level distractions, the daily stock market tickers, the flashy breaking news headlines. Think of those as just the weather. We want to understand the climate. And to truly grasp the massive macroeconomic forces that move entire nations, dictate global trade, and completely shift the balance of power, we have to uncover this incredibly complex engine operating underneath the whole shebang. So, we're going to break this intimidating macroeconomic topic down into simple, memorable study notes. We'll kick things off by studying the global engine of oil. Then we'll trace the history of the US dollar and unpack how the petrodollar system actually functions. After that, we'll follow the money through the petrodollar recycling loop and finally look at modern challengers like the BRICS nations. All right, Section 1, studying the global engine. We're looking at the massive global demand for oil. To really wrap our heads around the petrodollar, we first have to recognize one absolute, undeniable truth. Our entire modern economy is utterly dependent on a single commodity, oil. It's deeply embedded into our daily survival in ways we barely even register. I mean, we use it to fuel our cars, airplanes, and those massive cargo ships that transport literally all of our global goods. We use it to make plastics. In some places, it's actually burned to produce the electricity, keeping the lights on. We even use it to manufacture fertilizers and countless everyday chemicals. Because it is absolutely crucial for modern civilization, countries are constantly buying and selling it. But here's the catch. Production isn't even at all. You have massive producers like Saudi Arabia, and then you have massive consumers who produce barely a drop of their own, like Japan. And it's exactly this huge geographic imbalance that creates a relentless, nonstop global market for oil. Moving on to Section 2, the history of the dollar. We're going from gold to the Nixon shock. So how on earth did the US dollar come to control this massive, super essential global oil market? Let's take a quick step back in time. Right after World War II, the US economy was booming and largely intact, while much of Europe and Asia was just devastated. This led to the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, which essentially made the US dollar, which, by the way, was backed by physical gold at the time, the absolute center of the global financial system. Fast forward to 1971, and things fundamentally change. We get the infamous Nixon shock, where President Nixon completely decoupled the US economy from the gold standard. Then, just 2 years later in 1973, boom, the world gets slammed by the OPEC oil crisis. Arab oil-producing countries actually stopped selling oil to nations that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. This caused oil prices to absolutely skyrocket. They quadrupled, and it sparked severe, crippling inflation all over the world. In response to this total financial chaos, a really strategic, pivotal moment happened in 1974. But wait, before we get to that 1974 moment, it's super important to understand what actually happened when Nixon cut that tie to gold. The whole world essentially transitioned into a fiat currency economy. Now, a fiat currency is government-issued money that isn't backed by physical gold or silver or any tangible commodity. It gets its value purely from public trust and economic stability. Basically, it has value because we all agree it does. Because the US economy was just so enormous and stable back then, and since so many global transactions were already being settled in dollars anyway, the dollar managed to hold its ground as the world's reserve currency, heavily held by central banks everywhere. Okay, so back to the crisis. That severe 1970s inflation deeply threatened the world's trust in the dollar. To fight this, the US made a brilliant, total paradigm-shifting agreement with Saudi Arabia. The deal was incredibly straightforward. Saudi Arabia agreed to sell its oil exclusively in US dollars, period. And in return, the US promised them military protection and support. Because Saudi Arabia was the absolute titan of oil producers, it kind of forced all the other major oil-producing nations to eventually follow suit just to stay competitive. Which brings us to Section 3, the petrodollar system explained. Let's see why the entire world literally needs US dollars. That 1974 agreement officially birthed the petrodollar system as we know it. And the underlying logic basically goes like this. If every country needs oil, and oil is sold in dollars, then every country needs dollars. It's that simple. Let's go back to our example of Japan. Japan absolutely needs oil to power its factories and keep its citizens warm. But to buy that oil on the international market, they can't just hand over Japanese yen, no way. First, they must acquire US dollars. Second, they have to keep massive reserves of those dollars ready to go at all times. And third, they must consistently trade with the US or hold US assets just to maintain that dollar supply. And here is exactly why this matters to you and me. Because countries are essentially forced to stockpile US dollars like this, they're artificially propping up the value of the US currency every single day. And since every single importing nation is in Japan's exact position, it creates this constant, guaranteed global demand for the dollar. This gives the United States some pretty unbelievable macroeconomic advantages. First off, it keeps the dollar exceptionally strong, which means American consumers get way more purchasing power globally. Second, and honestly maybe the most important part, it allows the US government to borrow money much more easily and at much lower interest rates. Think about it for a second. Normally, if a government runs massive deficits, its currency tanks. But because the rest of the world always needs to hold dollars to buy oil, they end up parking those dollars in US debt. And finally, because international transactions have to pass through US regulated banks, it hands the US massive financial leverage. It literally allows them to use financial sanctions to economically isolate other countries. All right, Section 4, the petrodollar recycling loop. What actually happens to all those oil profits? Now, if you're a sharp student of geopolitics, you might be asking an obvious question right about now. What exactly happens to the massive mountains of cash that these oil-producing countries receive? I mean, they certainly aren't just hoarding giant vaults of physical paper bills like Scrooge McDuck. They invest it. And this creates a fascinating perpetual cycle known as petrodollar recycling. Here is how it flows. Step 1, oil importing countries buy oil using their hard-earned dollars. Step 2, the oil producers earn those massive dollar revenues. Step 3, instead of just sitting on the cash, those producers invest the dollars right back into U.S. assets. We're talking buying up U.S. government bonds, American real estate, and shares in U.S. companies. And finally, step 4, because those billions of dollars flow straight back into the U.S. financial system, the U.S. dollar stays incredibly strong, which reinforces the entire loop right back to the beginning.
And that leads us to Section 5, BRICS and dollar challengers, the gradual shift away from the dollar.
While this petrodollar system has completely dominated for half a century, the geopolitical landscape is definitely shifting. Recently, nations like Russia, India, and the broader BRICS trade alliance have kicked off strategies to trade oil in other currencies, like the euro or the Chinese yuan, specifically to reduce their dependence on the dollar. But here is the absolute million-dollar question. Why do countries that are actively hostile to the US still heavily trade in dollars? Well, it's exactly like when Facebook launched Threads to compete with Twitter. Even if you really want to switch to a new app, it's incredibly hard to get everyone else to move when all the action, all the users, and all the content are already on the old platform. In finance, we call this incumbent liquidity and network effects. Moving away from the petrodollar is just incredibly difficult. It's not like just changing a payment method on your phone. If a country suddenly switches currencies, they risk violently disrupting complex, long-standing shipping contracts. They break established international insurance and hedging systems. They can even crash historical pricing models that entire national budgets are based on. Furthermore, no other currency out there currently offers the incredibly high liquidity of the US dollar, meaning the ability to instantly move billions of dollars across the globe without crashing the market, coupled with extremely strong legal protections.
Because of all that risk, what we're observing right now is definitely not an overnight revolution. Instead, we're seeing a very gradual, highly selective shift. For example, Russia has increased its oil trade with China using the yuan and settled some transactions in rubles, mostly to dodge current sanctions. China is heavily encouraging trade settlements in yuan wherever it has the geopolitical leverage to do so. But the key takeaway here is this. These nations are reducing their dollar use where it is politically necessary, while still fully utilizing the dollar when it remains convenient and financially efficient.
However, these strategies to decentralize global finance are evolving fast, and some nations are looking far beyond just altering a few oil contracts. They are eyeing the foundational assets of the global economy itself. And that brings us to a critical, provocative question I want to leave you with today. Will China's strategic moves, leveraging unprecedented surges in the global gold market, successfully break the financial grip of the US dollar once and for all?
It's a massive, fascinating mystery that could literally redefine global finance for the next century. And it is exactly what we'll be exploring in our next explainer. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I'll catch you next time.